So this morning we're going to continue our series of looking at the mothers of Jesus. This has been our Advent series. It comes to us from the genealogy, the lineage of Matthew chapter 1. If you were to read that, you would see Matthew laying out the line from Abraham to Jesus. And normally this is just father to son, but we see that Matthew, he sprinkles in 5 women and he names 4 of them. And we were basically looking at a different woman, a different mother, each week of Advent. Now, as many of you know, I was sick last week. So instead of looking at Ruth last week, we're going to look at Ruth this week, and we're just going to move Mary to tonight, which is what we were probably going to do anyways. Now, the story of Ruth is probably pretty familiar for you if you've been in church before. It's a nice short book that's a common sermon series. Some of you may know that it was the first sermon series I gave when I became pastor of this church. And when I was looking at it again, kind of through the eyes of our series of Advent, I realized that one way that we can kind of look at it is it's a little bit of a parable, I think, for the American church in general, and perhaps fellowship in particular. And my hope then is that we would see how God is at work in this story, that we might begin to wonder how God is at work in our story today. And in particular, that we would see then the steps of faith that God's inviting us to take right now. So to do this, I'm going to read just Ruth chapter 1. I'll kind of fill in the rest of the story throughout, but I didn't think you wanted to sit through a full reading of the whole book. And what we're going to explore in the story is how we are like Naomi. And then we're going to look at the faith of Naomi and then consider what God might be asking us to do right now, what steps of faith he's inviting us to take today. So let's look at our text. It's from Ruth chapter 1. It's the whole chapter, verses 1 through 22. Hear these words from the book that we love. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned." At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab and accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So as I said, I think we are Naomi. And the we I mean is, like I said, the American church in general, and I think fellowship in particular. And the reason for that is because we can, like Naomi, remember days when we felt full. But now we look around and can see and feel the emptiness. This is exactly what we read Naomi says. At the end of the chapter, she comes home in shame and humiliated. And they go, "Is this Naomi? She's been gone for over 10 years. And she goes, "Don't call me Naomi." And what helps us know is in Hebrew, Naomi means pleasant. And she's like, my life isn't pleasant. Don't call me that. Call me Mara, which is Hebrew for bitter. And why does she say, don't call me pleasant, but call me bitter? She goes, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. She went away with a husband and 2 sons, and she comes back without either of them. And instead, she has a daughter-in-law to take care of. Now, why has this happened to Naomi? What has gone on? Well, Naomi's like any of us. On one hand, she's done some foolish things. And on the other hand, she's had some unfortunate things happen to her. In the area of the foolish things, she went with her husband, that they made this decision to leave Bethlehem and go to Moab. We read in our text that they left because there was a drought. And if we know the broader story of Scripture, the reason why there was a drought was because the people of Israel had started to stray from following God. And God had told them that when they inherited the promised land, which is where they were, that if they started to go astray, God would try to get their attention by causing a drought. And so what Naomi and her husband and her family, what they're doing is they're trying to avoid the discipline of God. And they're trying to avoid it by going someplace else, going to Moab. And that's a foolish thing to do. It's hard-headed, it's wrong, it's dumb, whatever word you want to use. But then, Naomi experiences real heartbreak. Her husband dies. Her 2 sons, they marry Moabite women, but then they're not able to have children. Right? They're married, it seems like in our text, for 10 years and no children. And then her sons die. And so she becomes this childless widow, which, as we've talked about before, is extremely low, kind of on the social ladder in the ancient world. And not only is she a childless widow, but she has 2 daughters-in-law that are her responsibility, that are essentially childless widows as well. And so it's not hard to imagine why Naomi goes, don't call me pleasant. My life is not pleasant. I'm bitter because I was full, and now I am empty. And as I said, I think Naomi is a good stand-in for the American church, and perhaps for us. Because if we've been in the church, whether this one or others for a time, we can think of times where the church felt more full. And I don't just mean numbers, I mean the life of the American church. And that's not true today. And why has this happened? Well, just like Naomi, there's foolish things that we've done and left undone. I don't want to get into the details of it because people will have different opinions about that, but nobody can argue that there are foolish things that we as fellowship have done and left undone, that the American church more broadly have done and left undone. And at the same time, there's also things that have happened that are beyond what any one church could have done, could have controlled. There have been cultural shifts in the world that's much bigger than any one church or locality. You know, if you pay attention to the statistics in America, 2020 radically changed the nature of church membership throughout the whole country. And I think part of it broadly in here was, I don't think any of the churches really knew how fragile our community was. And I don't know if there was anything we or any church could have really done to prepare for that year. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what led to us being here, but we know what it's like to be Naomi. To go, hey, I remember when we were full, but now I feel empty. And not only do we experience this as a community, but each one of us, or many of us, probably have stories of what this is like for us as individuals. Seasons and years where we felt full, and yet today we find ourselves feeling empty. And from this place of emptiness, I want us to take heart in the faith of Naomi. Now you may think as you read this text, I did not see Naomi have hardly any faith. And you're right, she doesn't have great faith. She is not in Hebrews 12 and kind of the hall of faith in Scripture. But she does have faith that leads to amazing things. The first sign of Naomi's faith is actually in the faith of Ruth. As we read, Naomi tries to convince her daughter-in-laws to stay, to not come with her. And Orpah eventually does, but Ruth clings to her, and this is what Ruth says. Ruth says to Naomi, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And that spelling of the Lord, when anytime you see that in an English translation, right, that what they're doing is they're translating the Hebrew word, which is the name of God, which we believe is pronounced Yahweh, but we always translate it like this. And we see that Ruth has come to a place of faith in the Lord, in the God of Israel. And how could she have done this? Well, because she learned about this God through Naomi. And maybe you add in the faith of Mahlon and Chilion and Elimelech, but again, none of those are people that you go, these people belong in the hall of faith. No, they had poor faith. They had weak faith. They had small faith. But it was enough to bring Ruth into faith with the living God. Now, if we keep reading the story of Ruth, we see more evidence of Naomi's faith. In Ruth chapter 2, we read about Ruth going out and collecting in the harvest. Because there was a law in ancient Israel that for those come harvest time, they couldn't harvest to the edge of the field. And not only could they not harvest to the edge of the field, they couldn't go back over the harvest. And the reason for this is that they were to intentionally leave harvest behind for people like Ruth, childless widows, to come and collect grain for themselves. Now, how does Ruth know to do this? Well, she's told by somebody. We don't read it in the text, but it's not too much of a stretch, but basically to imagine that it's Naomi that informs her that this is what she can go and do. And in some ways, what we see in Ruth is the opposite of what we saw a few weeks ago with Tamar. Tamar was abused by a man who abused a good law for his own benefit. And here we see something different. We see Ruth and how she benefits greatly simply from the small, tiny bit of faith of Naomi and the broader faithfulness of a community. Now, as the story continues, and some of us know this, right? We encounter Boaz. Boaz, who ends up becoming kind of the hero of the story. He's a close relative to the deceased husband of Ruth and Naomi. And he eventually becomes the hero. He becomes the kinsman redeemer. But if you look at the text, Boaz is only able to be there because Naomi guides Ruth step by step in the proper process. It's through the faith of Naomi that Boaz is able to become the hero of the story, to become the kinsman redeemer. And the end result of all of this, right, chapter 4, is Ruth and Boaz are married and they have a child. But if we look closer at what happens, you may be surprised at what we see. Because yes, first, on one hand, Ruth is taken care of. But to me, the surprise when I was looking at this text again this week was that what happens to Ruth, Naomi actually prayed for. And this is easy to overlook, but in chapter 1, Ruth prays for this. Naomi prays for Ruth and Orpah. And Naomi says, "May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." And that's exactly the result of the faith of Naomi. God used her tiny little faith to answer this prayer that she may have even forgotten that she ever even prayed. The second result of all of this is that we see that Naomi is restored. In chapter 4, after the birth of Ruth's child, this is what you read in the story. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This woman that was empty is now full. This woman who had lost everything, this woman who felt her life was bitter, found abundance, found fullness again because of her little faith in a faithful God. So we look at this story, we see that Naomi's faith led to this amazing fruit. Because on one hand, God had established good laws. It was God's good laws that others followed. That Naomi knew that she could rely upon, could tell Ruth that if she did this, she would get food. If she did this, she would get Boaz's attention. If she did this, she could have Boaz become her kinsman redeemer. But most importantly, it's not just the good laws that God did, but God prepared a man. God prepared Boaz. Because one of the coolest things as we look at the mothers of Jesus is to remember who is Boaz's mother. It's Rahab. It's the Canaanite prostitute we looked at a couple weeks ago. Rahab is the mother of Boaz. And so Boaz became one who grew up in a household of a woman who was a foreigner, who was estranged, who people were skeptical of, but knew that God had redeemed and brought in. And that shaped his whole life. That shaped him ready to be the type of man who would be faithful to what he was called to do. This tiny faith of Naomi only mattered because God had been at work long before any of this had happened. God had been at work years before this situation that Naomi was in. God had been at work when Naomi was full. God was at work when Naomi was bitter. God was at work in time long ago so that when she expressed a little bit of faith, God's faithfulness led to things beyond anything she could ask for or imagine. And this, of course, is just a small reflection of how God acts to us in Jesus. That God has been at work since before time to prepare a man to do a great work through his cross and resurrection so that our tiny faith, our inadequate faith, our weak faith in him would lead to our salvation, would lead to our renewal, would lead to our participation in the new creation. A little bit of faith goes a long way in a faithful God. A little bit of faith goes a long way in a faithful God. So what might this mean for us today? Because I think if we're honest, we know the emptiness we experience and what we feel. And from this place of emptiness, the invitation is always, what is God doing? How can we respond to how God's at work with our little bit of faith? And trust that he's at work in ordinary people and ordinary means to do something beyond what we could ask for or imagine. So I'm going to be very practical for just a few moments. The church has existed for a long time, and though the forms have changed, the content has not. The church has always been about four things: worship, community, discipleship, and service. And so I want to go through these four very quickly. And I want to invite you to think of one area where you can take what I'll call a 1% change. I'm not asking you to do anything big because the purpose isn't about what you and I can do, any great steps of faith that you and I can take, but the act is to trust in the faithful God who can use our small steps of faith to do something beyond what we could ask or imagine. So first, worship. What does a 1% change look like for worship? Well, for some, it's to show up more regularly. For others, it's to figure out how you might worship in different ways throughout the week. For others, it's showing up, being prepared and expectant to encounter the living God. This is what I mean. So 2.5 years ago now, on a Monday, I saw that there were 2 bulletins left out. And this rarely happens. Rarely are there any bulletins left out. But this struck me. These are 2 bulletins from the exact same Sunday. And this is back when we had the old logo. We had this one sheet. Some of you remember this. And there's this giant spot for sermon notes. And on this one, this person, I have no idea who wrote these. This person wrote, "Who in the congregation is the target for this sermon?" Okay, that's that person. This person wrote detailed notes. I could almost preach this sermon. I know what I said. They covered it. Detailed notes. At the end, there's a star where next to this line, I'm guessing I said it. I'll take credit for it as it sounds good. It says, "God offers to sustain us each day with his grace before we do anything right or good." To this person, I would say, sounds like a message everybody could benefit from. Right? But there's a difference in how we come to worship. Do we come prepared for what God might speak or say to us? Or are we coming to evaluate? Are we coming, sitting back, asking for me or the band to do something? Or are we coming expecting God to work through ordinary people and ordinary means? And selfishly, who benefited more from the service? Right? This person did. Second, in the life of the church is community. One of the primary ways that we help facilitate this is through our life groups. These life groups typically meet once a month and we share a meal together. And so for some of you, a step would be to join these. They're always open. You can always hop in one. You check the little circle. We'll get you in a group. And I know for some you go, well, once a month, that's not very much. And you're right. It's not very much. But to those who have done it month in and month out, relationships have deepened. Relationships have grown. You're absolutely right. It's not much, but if we look at the broader world that we're in the midst of a loneliness epidemic. And once a month is a whole lot more than what most people ever experience. And last, the beauty of these groups is that they're driven by the members of the group. So if once a month is not sufficient for you, if you think it could be more, the good news is once you join a group, you are able to say to the group, I would like this to be more. And you have a way to contribute to that. You have a way to bring that change that you would like to see to the group. Third area of the life of the church is discipleship. It's faith formation. This can take a variety of forms. Maybe it's just on your own, being more diligent in Bible reading. Maybe it's an area of study that you want to do. And if you want resources, I have resources. Maybe this is something that you don't want to do on your own. You want to do with somebody else. Ask a friend around you. Again, this is the hope of life groups, is bring it to your life group and say, hey, I would like to do a study on prayer. I would like to do a study on spiritual gifts. Ask those around you to do it with you. And fourth and last is service. We are always called to use our unique gifts and talents that God has given us to serve others. And this can be in so many different ways that I won't even try to give you options, but to just simply ask, what would it look like for me to take a 1% change in the area of service? And I'm asking you for small things because it's always about the faithful God who uses our small faith to do a whole lot more than what we can imagine. Because I think if we do these things, we might just find ourselves like Naomi, seeing God do stuff and answers to prayers that we may have prayed and even forgotten. And I know some are thinking that it won't mount to much, but that's the point. It's not about our great acts, our great faith. It's about the little faith in a faithful God. So there are two things to be cautious of thinking too little isn't going to do anything. And the other thing is just to be stuck in the blame game of wondering, how did we get here? How did we get to this place of emptiness? Was it something I did or didn't do? Was it something they did or didn't do? And those questions typically aren't helpful. The invitation of our text is to trust the one who brought us here. To trust that God is at work stripping us away of all that is fluff and extra, all the things that we think brought us fullness but didn't. To trust that he's the one that knows our emptiness, he knows our plight and has endured much more, and he promises to bring fullness to the places of emptiness. He promises to bring light to the places of darkness. And he says he will do it by his power and by his Spirit. Let me pray for us. God, we are so grateful that your work is not solely dependent on our faith, because our faith is inadequate, it is weak, it is small, it ebbs and it flows, and yet you are able to do amazing things when we take steps of faith. Because you're at work in ways beyond what we could see. You're at work in times when we feel full. You're at work in